Chapter 1, The Legacy of Shadows. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten years, the dim light from a single window barely cutting through the gloom. Elena stood amid the scattered remnants of her grandmother's life, faded photographs, brittle letters, and antique trinkets that whispered stories she could only guess at. She was about to close the lid of a cracked wooden chest when something caught her eye, a yellowed envelope tucked between the folds of an embroidered shawl. The handwriting on the front was delicate but deliberate, the ink slightly faded. The only clue to its origin was the signature, G. Curiosity pulled at her as she unfolded the letter, the aged paper crackling beneath her fingers. The words were passionate, brimming with emotion, and unmistakably intimate. It spoke of stolen moments, forbidden affection, and a love that defied the conventions of its time. But one line stood out: "Meet me at the house, where our souls are painted into the walls." Elena's gaze lifted, taking in the old manor where she now lived. Could her grandmother's secrets be tied to this house? And who was G? Later that day, she wandered into the grand living room, still holding the letter in her pocket as if its contents were too precious to leave behind. The air smelled faintly of oil paint, the source of which stood before her, a man in his early 30s, carefully restoring one of the family's old portraits. "Admiring my work?" he said without looking up, his voice smooth and low. "I didn't mean to intrude," Elena replied, startled. He turned then, a subtle smile playing on his lips. His dark hair fell in loose waves, and his sharp eyes seemed to take her in all at once, lingering just long enough to leave her slightly breathless. "You're not intruding," he said, setting his brush aside. "I'm Adrian. Restoring these pieces is my passion, and my job, of course. You must be Elena." She nodded, feeling her pulse quicken under his steady gaze. "How did you know?" "Your likeness is hard to miss," he said, gesturing toward the portrait he was working on, a depiction of her grandmother as a young woman. "The resemblance is uncanny." Elena stepped closer, her attention drawn to the intricate details of the painting. Adrian moved beside her, and she caught the faint scent of pine and turpentine clinging to his shirt. "I couldn't help but notice the letter you've been holding," Adrian said softly, his voice just above a whisper. Elena froze, the letter suddenly feeling like a guilty secret in her hand. "It's just something I found in the attic," she said, tucking it deeper into her pocket. His eyes flickered with interest, but he didn't press further. Instead, he gestured toward another portrait, this one faded and cracked with time. "You know, these paintings often hide more than meets the eye. Layers beneath layers, stories waiting to be uncovered." As the afternoon turned to evening, Adrian's presence seemed to fill the house in a way Elena couldn't explain. They found themselves seated together in the study, a pile of old letters and photographs spread out before them. "You're good at this," she said, watching as he gently unfolded a fragile piece of paper. "Patience is part of the job," he replied, glancing at her with a hint of a smile. "And curiosity. Every detail matters." He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers as he pointed to the corner of one photograph. "See this mark? It's a clue. Whoever wrote to your grandmother left hints like this, hoping they'd lead to something." Elena felt her breath hitch as his fingers grazed hers, an unspoken tension thickening the air. She glanced at him, her heartbeat quickening when she realized how close they were. His gaze lingered, dark and unreadable, before he leaned back, breaking the spell. "You'll have to be careful," he said, his voice lower now. "Some secrets are better left buried." Elena wasn't sure if he was warning her or tempting her. Chapter 2, The Colors of Temptation. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting warm, golden light through the manor's tall windows. Elena sat at the long dining table, surrounded by fragments of her grandmother's life, letters, photographs, and even a diary she had found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. Her mind buzzed with questions. Every word she read seemed to draw her deeper into a tangled web of forbidden passion and unspoken betrayal. But it wasn't just the past that occupied her thoughts. Adrian's presence lingered in her mind, an undercurrent she couldn't ignore. His sharp eyes, his careful hands, his voice that seemed to carry secrets of its own. Her heart skipped when the door to the room creaked open. Adrian stepped in, carrying a wooden pallet and brushes. "Busy unraveling mysteries?" he asked, his voice light but his expression deeply curious. "I can't stop," Elena admitted. "It's like every letter leads to another question. And some of it," she hesitated. "Some of it feels eerily familiar." "Familiar?" Adrian arched a brow and set his tools down. "How so?" She hesitated again, unsure if she should reveal the growing parallels between her grandmother's story and her own. "It's just the emotions. The intensity. It's like I can feel what she felt." Adrian tilted his head, studying her. "Maybe that's because some stories are destined to repeat themselves," he said softly. Later that afternoon, the two of them worked together to piece together the torn fragments of a family portrait. It was slow, meticulous work, and yet the proximity between them made it feel charged with an energy Elena couldn't deny. "Hold this," Adrian said, passing her a strip of canvas. Their fingers brushed briefly, and the contact sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Sorry," she murmured, flustered. "For what?" Adrian asked, his voice smooth, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. "It's just paint, Elena. No harm done." He stepped closer, pointing to the section she was holding. "See this color? The red here wasn't just a choice, it's a message. Red in art often signifies passion, danger, even betrayal." His voice dipped on the final word, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if he was speaking about the painting or about them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a storm began to gather. The first low rumble of thunder echoed through the halls just as the lights flickered. "Looks like we're in for a dramatic evening," Adrian said, his lips curving into a faint smile. By the time the storm broke, the manor was plunged into darkness. Elena lit several candles, their flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. Adrian stayed, claiming he wouldn't dare drive back to town in such weather. They found themselves in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine as the storm raged outside. The air was thick with electricity, not just from the weather, but from the unspoken tension between them. Adrian swirled the wine in his glass, his gaze locked on hers. "It's strange, isn't it? How a house can hold on to so many secrets." Elena nodded, though her thoughts were far from the house. "It feels alive sometimes. Like it's watching. Or like it's waiting," Adrian murmured, his voice low and velvety. Their conversation drifted to art, then to the letters, then finally to her grandmother's enigmatic life. Adrian leaned forward, the golden light from the candles catching the sharp lines of his face. "Your grandmother's story," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "it's more than just history, isn't it? You feel it, don't you? How it's pulling you in." Elena's breath hitched as he leaned even closer, his voice becoming almost conspiratorial. "It's not just the house," he said. "It's us. There's something here, between us, isn't there?" For a moment, the world seemed to still. Elena's heart raced as her mind scrambled for an answer. But before she could speak, Adrian leaned back, breaking the spell with a smile that was equal parts knowing and disarming. "You don't have to say it," he said softly. "Some things don't need words." The storm passed in the early hours of the morning, leaving the manor shrouded in an uneasy calm. Adrian left soon after, his parting glance lingering a second too long. Alone in the now quiet house, Elena sat with her thoughts, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of one of her grandmother's letters. For the first time, she wondered if the secrets she was uncovering were truly about her grandmother, or if they were about her own desires, buried deeper than she dared to admit. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. The morning sunlight broke through the heavy drapes of the manor, casting soft golden streaks across the study. Elena sat at the desk, surrounded by scattered fragments of her grandmother's past, letters, diary pages, and photographs. Her fingers traced the edges of a newly discovered envelope, its seal long broken, the handwriting delicate but certain. Inside was another letter from G. It spoke of a love too bold for its time, of meetings in hidden rooms and stolen nights beneath the stars. But this letter ended differently, its final lines abrupt and charged with an ominous tone. We must be careful. They're beginning to suspect us. I can't let this ruin you. Elena's heart raced as she reread the words. There was an urgency in the letter, a sense of looming danger that made her pulse quicken. Had her grandmother's love affair ended in scandal, or worse? Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. Elena? Adrian's voice carried through the wood, smooth and familiar. Come in, she called, hastily tucking the letter into the folds of the diary. Adrian entered, a faint smile on his lips, though his dark eyes seemed to notice everything. You've been busy, he said, nodding to the mess of papers spread across the desk. Just trying to piece things together, she replied, her voice tight. Adrian stepped closer, his presence filling the room. And what have you found? For a moment, she hesitated. His interest was palpable, but so was the weight of her uncertainty. Another letter, she admitted finally. It's troubling. It feels like there was more going on here than just a romance. His gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his expression. Perhaps some stories aren't meant to be uncovered, he said softly. But then again, maybe the truth is exactly what you need. That afternoon, Elena wandered into the overgrown garden behind the manor, her thoughts tangled as she replayed the letter's words in her mind. Adrian found her there, his jacket draped casually over one arm, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms streaked faintly with paint. You seemed lost, he said, his tone light, though his eyes were anything but. Just thinking, she replied, her voice distant. About the past, he asked, stepping closer. About how much it resembles the present, she said before she could stop herself. Adrian's lips curved into a small smile. History has a way of repeating itself. He moved closer still, his presence magnetic. Elena, he said, his voice low and intimate, you feel it too, don't you? This connection between us. She froze, her heart pounding as he reached for her hand. His fingers were warm, steady, as they closed gently over hers. This isn't just about your grandmother, he continued. It's about us. Whatever this is, you can't deny it. Her breath hitched, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, desire, fear, and something darker she couldn't name. I don't know what to think, she said finally, her voice trembling. Then don't think, Adrian replied, his eyes holding hers. Just feel.
Later that night, unable to sleep, Elena wandered into the dimly lit hallway, her steps drawing her toward the studio where Adrian worked. The faint scent of paint and varnish filled the air, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the room. Adrian was there, standing before a canvas, his posture relaxed but his focus intense. He didn't notice her at first, his attention fixed on the brush in his hand. The painting was half-finished, a vivid depiction of the manor, its windows glowing as if holding secrets within. Elena, he said without turning, as if he'd sensed her presence. I didn't mean to disturb you, she said, lingering in the doorway. You're not disturbing me, he replied, finally setting his brush down. He turned to face her, his expression softening. In fact, I was hoping you'd come. She stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Why? Because I feel like we're standing on the edge of something, he said, his voice steady but his eyes intense. Something bigger than either of us. Her heart raced as he approached, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped just short of touching her, his presence overwhelming. You're part of this story, Elena, he said, his voice a near whisper. I don't know how or why, but you are. And so am I. The air between them felt electric, charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged desires. Adrian lifted his hand, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was brief but lingering, enough to make her pulse quicken. I should go, she said, her voice barely audible. Do you want to? He asked, his gaze searching hers. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a trembling breath, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. Back in her room, Elena sat on the edge of her bed, her mind spinning. She pulled the letter from its hiding place and reread its final lines. We must be careful. They're beginning to suspect us. I can't let this ruin you. As she traced the words with her finger, a chill ran down her spine. Was the danger her grandmother faced now echoing in her own life? And if so, could she trust Adrian, or was he part of the shadows closing in around her? Chapter 4, The Rift and the Closeness. The rain began to fall in earnest the following morning, washing the windows of the manor in streaks of silver. Elena stood in the study, the room dim despite the flickering light of the fire. Spread across the desk were the letters she'd found, the diary entries, and the fragments of her grandmother's life she'd painstakingly pieced together. But her thoughts weren't on the letters. They were on Adrian. His words, his touch, his presence, they lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't forget. Yet, beneath the longing, a gnawing doubt had taken root. How much did he know? How much had he been keeping from her? Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the letters, the inked words seeming heavier now. The lines hinted at a betrayal, a secret so profound it had fractured her grandmother's life. Elena's chest tightened as she realized the parallels weren't just coincidental. A knock at the door startled her. Adrian stepped inside, his movements unhurried, his gaze immediately locking onto hers. You found something, haven't you? He asked, his tone careful, almost too careful. Elena hesitated, then folded the letter, slipping it into her pocket. It's nothing, she said. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't push. You're keeping things from me, Elena, he said softly. I thought we were past that. Are we? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. You've been keeping secrets too, Adrian. I see it in the way you speak, in the way you act. You know more than you're telling me. For a moment, his composure faltered. He stepped closer, his expression both pained and determined. You're right, he admitted. I do know more. And it's time I told you the truth. Adrian led her to a part of the manor she had never explored before. The air grew colder as they descended a narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. At the bottom was a heavy wooden door. This is where the truth lies, Adrian said, his voice low as he pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb, its glow illuminating walls lined with paintings. Each one bore the signature G. Elena's breath caught as she stepped inside. The paintings were vivid, almost alive, portraits, landscapes, and abstract pieces that seemed to bleed emotion. But one painting in particular drew her attention. It was of her grandmother, her face radiant with a secretive smile, her eyes brimming with a love that seemed almost painful. These are Gabrielle's works, Adrian said, standing close behind her. Your grandmother's lover. He painted these for her, each one a piece of their story. Elena turned to face him, her pulse racing. How do you know this? How long have you known? Adrian hesitated, then spoke, his voice heavy. I've been searching for this room for years. Gabriel was more than an artist to your family, he was my great-grandfather. My connection to this house brought me here, but I stayed for you. His words struck her like a thunderclap. You knew all along, she whispered, her voice trembling. You came here because of them? At first, yes, he admitted. I wanted answers, just like you. But when I met you, his voice faltered, and he reached for her hand. Everything changed. Elena, you're more than just part of this story. You're my story now. Elena pulled her hand away, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and something she couldn't name. "You used me," she said, her voice shaking. "No," Adrian said quickly, stepping closer. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know this would happen, us. I didn't plan for any of this. But it's real, Elena. You have to believe that." Tears welled in her eyes as she turned back to the paintings. I can't trust you." "How can I?" Adrian's voice softened. "Because everything I've done since meeting you has been for you. I stayed because of you. I'm telling you everything because I want you to know the truth, even if it costs me what little chance I have left with you." His words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For a moment, Elena felt the pull between them, the undeniable connection that had grown despite everything. But the weight of the secrets, the lies, was too much. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Adrian nodded, his expression a mixture of pain and understanding. "Take all the time you need. But don't walk away from this, Elena. Don't walk away from us." That night, Elena sat in her room, the letter from G in her lap. The image of her grandmother's face in the painting haunted her, along with Adrian's words. She felt torn, as though the shadows of the past were pulling her in one direction, while the possibilities of the present tugged her in another. In her heart, she knew she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. But whether she could forgive Adrian, or herself, was a question that loomed as heavily as the storm clouds gathering outside.
Chapter 5. The End and the Beginning. The next morning broke gray and silent, the manor heavy with the aftermath of secrets unearthed. Elena sat by the window in her room, staring out at the mist-covered gardens. Adrian's words from the night before echoed in her mind, their weight impossible to ignore. She ran her fingers over the edges of the letter from Gabrielle, the one she'd read countless times but still couldn't fully grasp. "We must be careful. They're beginning to suspect us. I can't let this ruin you." It was as if her grandmother were speaking to her through time, urging her to see the dangers of giving too much to a love that could never fully be hers. Adrian had left her a note, slipped under her door. She unfolded it with trembling hands. "I'll wait for you in the studio. If this is goodbye, let it at least be on our terms." Her heart ached as she read the words. Part of her wanted to stay in her room, to let him leave and take his secrets with him. But another part, the one that had felt the undeniable pull between them from the moment they met, couldn't let him go without one last confrontation. She found him in the studio, standing before the painting of her grandmother. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, but his expression softened when he saw her. "You came," he said quietly. Elena nodded, stepping closer but keeping her distance. "I couldn't let you leave without saying everything I need to say." Adrian gestured to the painting. "She's the reason I came here," he said, his voice raw. "But you're the reason I stayed. I never meant to hurt you, Elena. Everything I've done since meeting you, it's been for you." She crossed her arms, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But you didn't tell me the truth, Adrian. You kept things from me. How can I trust you?" He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "Because I'm here now, giving you everything I have. My family's past is tangled with yours, but that doesn't mean we have to repeat their mistakes. I know I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid of losing you before I even had you." Elena's breath hitched at his words, and for a moment, the vulnerability in his voice almost broke through the walls she had built. Adrian led her to the far end of the studio, where another painting was draped in a white sheet. He hesitated before pulling it away, revealing a new portrait. It was of Elena. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The painting was breathtakingly vivid, capturing her as if through his eyes. There was strength in her gaze, a quiet resolve, but also a hint of vulnerability. "This is how I see you," Adrian said softly. Not just as someone caught in the shadows of the past, but as someone strong enough to find her own way out of them. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the portrait. For the first time, she saw herself not as a piece of a larger story, but as someone who could write her own. "I can't stay," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I can't be part of something that's built on so many lies and secrets. I need to figure out who I am on my own." Adrian's face fell, but he nodded, his eyes filled with both pain and understanding. "I won't stop you," he said. "But know that what we had, it was real. It still is."
As the day wore on, Adrian packed his things, leaving the studio empty once more. Before he left, he placed the portrait of Elena in the grand living room, a silent reminder of the connection they had shared. Elena watched from the window as his car disappeared down the long driveway. The manor felt impossibly quiet without him, but for the first time, she didn't feel trapped by its silence. She returned to the study, gathering the letters and diary pages one last time. Each word, each fragment of her grandmother's story, was now a part of her, but they no longer defined her. That evening, she lit a single candle in the study and sat before the portrait Adrian had painted of her. She traced the lines of her face, marveling at the strength he had seen in her even when she hadn't seen it herself. The shadows in the room seemed lighter now, less menacing, as if the house itself had exhaled. Elena closed her eyes and whispered to the empty space, "I will find my way. And it will be mine." The candle flickered, its light steady against the dark, as Elena turned to the future, not as a continuation of the past, but as the author of her own story.
Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.